Welcome back to the fifth podcast in the series. This week we're discussing the best films of the 1960s. I'm here with the usual crew, which is Dawn, Kev and Chris. Hello everyone. Kev doing his usual grin. You'll notice this week that Kev has worked out how to use a camera properly, so that's very nice. You can actually see most of his face. I hope it doesn't crop in, because then that's not going to make sense, and I'll have to cut it out anyway. We always describe what was happening in each decade. So this week, Chris is going to summarize the 1960s for us. So go ahead, Chris.
In my head, it's almost like a decade of two halves. And the first half is kind of following on from what's going on in the 50s. So there's still a lot of epics going around, some of the major ones being things like Lawrence of Arabia. And these are kind of phasing out a bit because there's been huge disasters, huge flops like Cleopatra. There's still a lot of film noirs, although these are sort of changing their style a little bit. There's a lot of psychological horror, which had kind of started in the 50s with things like Les Diaboliques, but you've got obviously the big famous one, Psycho, coming up, but there's a lot of others as well, lots made by Hammer. There's more sort of screwball comedies and more musicals. Big ones being West Side Story, Sound of Music. And there's more westerns, but there's a kind of change of what these are. They're more sort of gritty and less clean cut. In Britain, there's a lot of social realism, what people have called the angry young men kind of movies, things like Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, This Sporting Life. But there's also things like, this is more of a TV thing, but Kathy Come Home. So it isn't all just men. There's also a sort of growing interest in space, which I think parallels the space race that's happening at the time, with a lot of movies about space coming out, specifically 2001, and a favourite of mine, Planet of the Apes. There's an interest in spy fiction, the birth of the James Bond movies. It's also the first ever sort of mainstream, what we would call a zombie movie, with Night of the Living Dead. But as I said, I think that there's a kind of second movement going on in the 60s as well, which covers lots of different bases, but is a kind of rule-breaking idea. And I think this comes in many forms. There's sort of people who've been affected by the new movements in film theory, who sort of understand the limits and techniques and are trying to break them, people like the French New Wave. There's the sort of cultural revolutions going on because of the change in music and attitudes, sort of things like the Beatles and the music films that are coming out at the time. There's sort of directly revolutionary movies against war and against sort of capitalism, things like a lot of movies about Vietnam. There's the Battle of Algiers as well, Dr. Strangelove, If, things like that. There's a lot of kind of wider psychedelic movies. There's a lot of movies about dealing with the civil rights struggle. And in the late 60s, sort of Sidney Poitier becomes quite a big star. There's really the birth of African cinema after a lot of countries become freed from colonial rule. And there's a rise in female emancipation and sort of female filmmakers, which we may talk about when we discuss some of the films. There's also the end of the Hays Code, which is the code that said what you could and couldn't do in cinema. But that had kind of been on the wane because people were breaking the rules all the time, and kind of got killed by the birth of New Hollywood, which we might talk about more in the 70s. So for me, I think the 60s is kind of decade of change and energy and protests and the rise of new possibilities in film, both themes and in style.
Thanks very much. So the first film we have decided to talk about this week is Daisies. Who would like to summarize the plot of Daisies?
I mean, I could try if you want.
Go for it.
It doesn't really have a plot in a sense. The Daisies is about two young women who, for various different, it's almost in a sense like a sort of skit comedy film in a sense. it goes through two young women who go into various situations and act in very anarchic ways. There isn't really any kind of developing plot lines in it. They meet various old men who they embarrass in different ways. They have various arguments with each other about sort of philosophical ideas, and they make a mess of lots of food. But that's really as much of a plot as there is.
I think Daisies is a really interesting example of what you were talking about in your summary there, about that sort of rise in 60s counterculture, that kickback against the establishment. And I think it captures that kind of almost anarchic spirit that existed in the 60s. Yeah, what does everyone else think? Dom, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the first time I watched it, I wasn't sure I really got it, even though I like the visual side of it. I think I find the characters quite annoying, or more annoying than fun and liberating. And I didn't really see the meaning behind it all. I just kind of took it for maybe face value. But this time round watching it, I got a lot more out of it, I think, whilst still also being a bit confused by it all. And maybe not understanding everything I saw. So at first I kind of thought it was about female empowerment in the way they kind of rebel and doing unladylike things and stuffing their faces and getting drunk and making a scene. And then in the middle, it kind of became a bit more existential. And then by the end, it kind of seemed more like a dig at rich people who are kind of insulated from all the bad things that are going on in the world, and who choose to distract themselves with all fancy food and entertainment. So it kind of could be about all of those things, but also about none of them, which is maybe what makes it so great.
Yeah, I think that's right, and yeah, come to Kev as well, because Kev and I kind of discussed this briefly, and like we were similar to what you've said. It covers so many different ideas that everybody kind of takes something different from it. Kev, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, well, before we start, you know what I've done? I've Googled the director's name because I find it very difficult to remember. It's Vera Chittilova. She's got a very, very interesting career. And I think the beauty of Daisies, which kind of encapsulates her career, is that it's because of the kind of humorous surrealism of it. I would say I didn't really understand what was going on the first time I watched it, but it floods over. I saw it in a cinema, floods over you, and you just enjoy it. It's very funny. I think if you just let it wash over you, then it's just this great surrealist film that's throwing a lot of really abrasive visual ideas at you. The cutting's very experimental. It is quite sketchy. It's there for a lot of visual experiments to occur in front of you. It's got almost a bit like Monty Python or something. And a bit like the French New Wave as well. Obviously, this was part of the Czech New Wave, and Vera was one of the few women in the Czech New Wave. So yeah, it's got a lot of feminist vibes about it. It's got a discussion about the socio-political situation at the time in the country, and it's got a wider idea about the counterculture. But it's you don't really have to know any of that or think about any of that to enjoy it. It can just be a fun comedy as well.
That's it, isn't it? I really think that you can come into it and you can enjoy it as a fun comedy. You can enjoy it as a kickback against the establishment and the perceived sort of greed of the leaders of the time. You can look at it as the sort of trod upon people kicking back against the establishment as well, and saying, well, no more, we'll be greedy ourselves, we'll take like they have from us. So there's so many ways of looking at it, and I think they're all correct. Like, I don't think there's necessarily one of them that's the wrong way of looking at it. It's just whichever way you come out of it looking at it. I think that's quite often the sign of a really good film.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff in it where they're talking about how they've like become bad, and it kind of opens with them eating apples, which Vera later did a film called Fruits of Paradise, which redoes the kind of Adam and Eve story, at least at the start. There's a later film, I was telling Joel about this the other day, there's a later film called Traps, where a man Yeah. Do you know which scene I'm going to talk about? Like,
yeah, I think I do.
Yeah, where a man gets like, it's all about a man who's committed various sexual assaults, and then this woman cuts out his balls, and he thinks he can go to the doctor the next day and get them put back in. So he puts them in a jar and he puts them in the fridge. But it turns out his flatmate thinks they're kidneys, so he cooks them, and he, like, the original guy walks back in to find his flatmate eating his balls that he's cooked.
That's one of my favourite bits in Daisy is when she's got, I think it's Julia, the character Julia, she's got a guy on the phone to her, and she's got the receiver just on the bed, and he's saying, "I love you so much, I love you." And her and her flatmate are just chopping up various fruits and vegetables that are all phallic.
Yeah.
It's sort of castrating guys, but with like bananas and gherkins. Brilliant. Oh, it's hilarious. It's a funny film. I can see maybe some people would find it really annoying. It's one of those films, if anybody said I don't like this film, I would sympathise entirely.
It's not going to be forever.
Laugh from start to finish.
Yeah. And what do we all think about, because one of the things that always sticks with me is how visually striking it is. It's got a really interesting use of colour washes throughout. It's really interestingly edited, and it's quite choppy. And what do we all think of that? Because, like, again, I can understand somebody watching that and being really irritated by that. For me, like, it sticks with me, and it's one of the things that I like most about it. I think it's an incredibly interesting and innovative film visually, and I love that about it. What about you, Don?
Yeah, I think it's funny because when you're watching it and you're used to kind of analysing films, you kind of think everything has a meaning in it, like every different colour tint must mean something, but it's kind of the opposite in that, you know, she's doing that because she can. It doesn't have to mean something. And I guess I was kind of reading, I was kind of comparing it to like Dadaism, and I don't know much about that, but I think that whole spirit of that is what she's trying to do in it.
Yeah. So why would we all say that we love Daisies, Chris?
So I think it's just the kind of energy that it has. A lot of the reason that I like it could actually be taken from when we discussed and we gave the best film of the decade to Duck Soup, in a way, because
I think Duck Soup is the sequel.
Yeah,
yeah, they had this. It's just got this manic energy where it's like, we're gonna take aim at absolutely everything, and we're gonna try and tear down everything that we can, whether it's something that, like, you might agree with or you might disagree with, whether it's like the actual filmmaking itself, because there are like bits which just, like, as Don said, changes happen in the filmmaking just for no reason except for just it would be shocking or it would be like exciting. And I think the entire film is just filled with exciting possibilities, and it's incredibly funny.
Yeah. For me, I would agree with almost all of that as well. I actually came out of it because I rewatched it. I wasn't even, when we discussed it, I wasn't even convinced I'd seen it, but turned out I had. But when I rewatched it, I came out of it actually quite inspired about filmmaking again in a lot of ways, because it's doing something different that you don't see in a lot of films. Like, it's not necessarily sticking to any form of traditional narrative. It's making a pushback. It's kind of angry in a way, but it's also really funny. And the color tints and everything are really inspired, and it probably made me think about filmmaking in a way I hadn't in a while. And so for that reason, I think it's a really amazing film. What about you, Kev?
Yeah, I think you both summed it up really well, to be honest. It's got a very anarchic spirit that's a bit Marx Brothers-y, a bit Buñuel-like. And it's also pretty emblematic of a lot that's happening in the 60s at the time, with the manic cutting and experimentation in supposedly mainstream films. And it's, you know what, it's funny. I like a film that can be really angry and really funny at the same time. And I find them both very endearing characters as well. They're fun to be around. So,
Don?
Yeah, I think I find it constantly surprising I think even if you keep watching it or watch it again and again, I think there'll always be something in it that you wouldn't have noticed or that you'll look at differently each time. And yeah, it's like the perfect length, isn't it? It doesn't go on so much that you get exhausted by it. It just, that's it.
I think that's right. Yeah, if it was a 2.5 hour long film, it would probably be very annoying.
That's a good point actually. Because a lot of people, the people who have watched this podcast, it's kind of people who might not have necessarily seen films like this, and when you say it's a Czechoslovakian surrealist film, maybe that's a little intimidating. But it's only 70 minutes long, and it's a right laugh, and it's quite easy to track down.
Yeah.
So if you want to dip your toe in that ocean, that's a good place to start.
Exactly. And if you don't like it, it's only 70 minutes. So the second film that we've included in this list is The Apartment.
So it's about a man, played by Jack Lemmon, who works in a very large insurance company in New York. And he frequently stays late after work, which at first you think is because he works really hard and he wants to move up in the company that way. But we find out that he's been giving his apartment key to various senior people in the company so they can take their ladies they're having affairs with too. And he ends up kind of making his way up in the company because of this, because they put in good words for him for doing that favor for him. And he likes a girl who works the elevators, played by Shirley MacLaine. And then he kind of finds out that his boss is kind of sleeping with her, and he wants to, but he also might just want some company. And stuff happens that is sad and that's happy, and then it ends.
It's sad, then it's happy, then it ends.
That's a very good summary of the ending of The Apartment, to be honest.
I don't think we can say anymore, do we? I think that's
yeah. Yeah. So did we all rewatch The Apartment in prep for this?
I rewatched it this morning.
Yeah.
And seen it in a decade.
So that's a good start then. What did you take from it a decade later?
Well, I mean, I was really interested to watch it as an older person, because you have a completely different perception of Jack Lemmon's character, for one thing. Because obviously all these things still apply, but when I was younger, he just seemed like a spineless careerist to an extent, he's not a particularly sympathetic character. As I thought when I was younger. And rewatching it this morning, I found there was a lot more I could identify with him. I understood that his bosses were holding something over him, which is if he doesn't let them use his apartment, then he'll get fired. And I've had bosses be a little bit manipulative maybe in past professional experiences. And you go, oh God, there's a lot in that. And you also appreciate, I lived on my own for a while, and I still live on my own, but I was on my own, single and working from home. And that's a very depressing experience. I spent 2 weeks not talking to anyone a lot of the time. And suddenly Jack Lemmon, there was little mannerisms I noticed in his performance. And it's, I think, an underrated performance.
So do I.
Because Shirley MacLaine's a bit of a scene stealer. So Jack Lemmon kind of gets sidelined. But there's these elements where he starts speaking to people who he likes, and it's an entirely different vocal register. It's this twitchy excitability. And he's not only excited to be talking to them, he's excited because he thinks, I'm not going to be lonely anymore. And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
This is the first time as a significantly older man after 10 years where I cried at The Apartment at the end of it.
Yeah, I rewatched it and took a lot more from it this time as well. And very much agree with what you're saying about Jack Lemmon's character. I had the exact same opinion as you. He was a spineless little worm when I first watched it, and this time rewatching it, there are loads even the little bit where all he wants to do is show her this new hat he's got, and he's just desperately seeking approval. He's just desperately wanting someone to approve of this new look that he's chosen for himself. And even that, it kind of affects me in that way. You're like, he's not just spineless, he's he's underconfident. He's lost something somewhere along the way, and there's a lot more to him.
That's what the promotion's all about as well. Sorry, I'll let someone else speak in a minute, but that's what the promotion's all about as well. It's not that he desperately needs this promotion. It's that he wants to be a part of the group. He's an intensely lonely person. You find out reasonably late on in the film that he's attempted suicide at some point in his life because he tried to sleep with his friend's wife.
Yeah.
So you can assume he was part of a reasonably large friend group and was then excluded from that because he tried to shag his friend's wife, tries to kill himself, moves to New York, becomes a sort of anonymous, spineless guy by the time he's pushing 30-ish. And that's how he's lived his life. And these are all layers that, I deeply empathise with.
Can you tell that Kev and I rewatched it and we're both just like, I love it so much. What about you?
That poor man! That poor man!
What about you, Chris?
I hadn't watched it in a while either, actually. And I came back to it. I don't know. I have complicated feelings about it because I think it's better than I thought it was, but I dislike Jack Lemmon more than I used to. But I mean, like, I dislike is it C.C. Baxter more than I used to, rather than Jack Lemmon, who I think gives an amazing performance in this movie. Because I think the first time I saw it, I thought this is a really funny movie, and kind of in the vein of the old Christmas suicide movies that I love, like Shop Around the Corner or something. I was like, it's just kind of this like very fast talking comedy movie which has darker elements in it. And I think watching it this time, I became aware a lot more of the and I viewed Jack Lemmon as this extremely amusing character, and now coming back to it, as Kev says, as like an older person, I think I can see his fallibilities a lot more. And so I think I've watched it before and just went, why would you not like him? He's really fun to watch. And now I see what fallibilities his character has, and I find him a little bit disgusting at points. Like, overall, I think that at the end he sort of comes good, but there's like definitely points where some of the stuff he does is really despicable. And also, I think this time around, I had a lot more respect and interest in the plotline that Shirley MacLaine goes through. I think because her character isn't really the focus of the comedy, she has funny lines like here and there, but like she's more the focus of like the dramatic elements of the film. And so I think when I watched it the first time around, I kind of viewed it more as a comedy, and so I found like her plotline, I was like, oh, well, that's just like, it's like dark and interesting, but it's not what I'm most interested in.
Yeah,
I found kind of her freeing herself from this horrible abusive relationship that she's in sort of quite moving in a way that I didn't get the first time around. And so I found it a very kind of, it's a very dark and heartbreaking movie in a lot of ways. Because like, as you said at the end of the movie, it's like these people have escaped from horrible situations, but it's like they all feel quite real, the situations that they're in. So a lot of the film is just like, oh, look at all the awful things you have to do if you're trapped in this situation. But then, as Dawn said, it's sad, but then it's happy.
Dawn, on that, Dawn, I'm really interested to hear what you think about the sort of characterizations then. So Shirley MacLaine's character and Jack Lemmon's character, because you've got me and Kev thinking this time watching it, he does some despicable things, but he came across in a different light to us. And then maybe Chris with a slightly different opinion. What were your thoughts on this rewatch?
Yeah, because I guess it had been maybe about 10 years or so since I'd watched it as well, and I think I did kind of remember it more as the kind of lighter elements of it, and I kind of forgot how dark and disturbing it can be at times, but it never really feels like that way at the same time. Like, all the characters they're quite sweet and likable, but then they're all flawed, which maybe makes them feel more real in a way.
I think that Billy Wilder, before this, for quite a few years, was making arguably frivolous sex comedies. The 7 Year Itch isn't long before this, and he's kind of known as a little sleazy at times. Billy Wilder, a lot of his comedy can be sort of about sex and about that kind of almost the start of that sexual revolution that was happening. Playboy would have come out about 4 years before The Apartment did.
Yeah, it was 50.
And I think it's very telling that one of the characters who is one of the sleazy bosses uses the term playmate.
Yeah.
Which wouldn't have been a term 10 years before. I think this is the beginning of him sort of critiquing that in a way, and sort of a culture that he had profited from in something like The 7 Year Itch. Now he's questioning a little bit and interrogating a little bit, which I think is why these characters are much darker. This is the sex comedy. This is the carnage that's left after the sex comedy.
Yeah.
These are the victims that would exist once the ending of the fun, frothy sex comedy.
Even though Jack Lemmon's character does some really horrible things, I don't think you ever really think he's truly a horrible person.
No.
Because there's that kind of likableness at the start. So then by the end, he's had a really nice arc, and it's satisfying because you've seen the good and the bad.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, completely. Have you got some fun facts about The Apartment, Don?
Well, I think my favourite was about how they created the vast sea of faces in the insurance company by using full-size actors at the front at desks, and then children dressed in suits and tiny desks. And behind them had even smaller desks with cut-out figures operating.
Is that true?
That's fantastic.
Are you making up your fun facts now? Because that sounds...
I know I did, but I think it's true.
Wow.
That is a fantastic fact.
Yeah, isn't it?
I just feel like how cynical Billy Wilder is. I don't know if he should be directing children, to be honest. Don't let him near them.
Children in suits.
Yeah.
And also, apparently, the studio wanted Groucho Marx for the role of Dr. Dreyfus. Wilder said no.
Which would have been terrible and wouldn't have worked. Yeah.
He stated that he wanted an actor with more dramatic weight for the
Well, I mean, the Doctor is one of the best characters in the film. It wouldn't have worked if it was Groucho Marx wandering in.
Or would it have been even better?
Definitely not. No, definitely not. Right. So let's summarize then. Why did we all love The Apartment? And also on that, why did we all love it? Why do you think we all loved it more this time round than we did maybe 5-10 years ago? Kev?
Well, I've had a rough 10 years, Joe. I think that Billy Wilder is a grown-ups director. You can find him very funny when you're younger, but there's a lot of very dark, very adult elements that are not even hiding in his films. I mean, there's a prolonged suicide sequence in The Apartment that's deeply troubling. But it also requires a very adult sense of empathy, I think. Shirley MacLaine's someone who's sleeping with her boss who she knows has a wife. That's not a sympathetic position to be in, but you completely empathise with her and with her trouble. Jack Lemmon is a very lonely man who's doing something very reprehensible. The only person who's not particularly reprehensible is Fred MacMurray's character, who's a sort of Don Draper, a proto-Don Draper. Yeah, it is funny, and it's got a very bleak sensibility that appeals to me personally. And it's amazingly written. It's astonishingly written. Billy Wilder can write a script like no one else. So yeah, I had a very fond memory of it, but it was even better than I could possibly remember.
And Don?
I think for me it perfectly captures the kind of big city loneliness that even though everyone is surrounded by people all the time, there's a melancholy in the air that everyone deals with in different ways. Whether it's hanging around bars and picking up strangers like what Jack Lemmon and the women do, or if it's having affairs even though they're supposed to be kind of happily married. Yeah, it's kind of all about the ways in which people pretend to be happy and keeping up that illusion. And it's also very realistic in its portrayal of love as well. And it doesn't just give you like a big happy ending. It's kind of, it should be in a way because they're together, but it doesn't say that everything's fixed now.
Yeah.
And it's got great visual storytelling as well. And obviously, like we mentioned, the script and the performances are very good as well.
I like that like big city loneliness idea. I think it probably captures that better than just about any film does, really. And that idea. And also, like, I think some of the scenes that are like less comedic and more dark, I think maybe don't necessarily get the credit that they're due. Like watching it back, it's some of those scenes are very difficult to watch, and like the portrayal of Shirley MacLaine's attempted suicide is actually really very brutal, and the doctor coming round and making her purge and all these things are very challenging to watch, and it's incredibly well acted. Fred McMurray I can occasionally find smarmy and bland, but in this he's smarmy and bland in the way his character is, and it's perfectly portrayed. I think it's incredibly well acted. It's really funny, but it's also sad and it's dark. And like I say, I like films that can bring you out of it with a complex range of emotions. And this is one of those ones that's absolutely perfect for that. What about you, Chris?
I think that it's almost like there's two films going on at once. And one of them is the sort of screwball comedy, almost like proto-sitcom film about the setup, where it's like there's this guy and then he's got this apartment where this stuff's happening and it's kind of like wacky and silly and it's got loads of jokes. And then there's the sort of real life of how this would happen, which is filled with really sad characters with really sort of dramatic arcs. And I think each of those would be enjoyable in their own rights. But the apartment kind of does a balancing act where it's both of them at the same time. And like from one scene, it'll jump from one to the other. And so you'll have like the most dramatic scene and then it will end with a joke. Or you'll have like a really funny scene and then something really horrible will happen in it. And so it's kind of two films and both of them are great films, and combining them just makes it this very unique experience.
So the third film we're going to discuss is Alphaville. Chris, you like Alphaville a lot. Do you want to do the summary of this one?
Oh, okay, well, I thought Kev might want to, but fair enough.
Well, Kev hasn't done one yet. Kev, do you want to do Alphaville?
Yeah, right. So Alphaville is a French neo-wave film by Jean-Luc Godard. It is a curious mixture of sci-fi, film about modernity in the vein of Antonioni. Godard himself calls it a Western. And it's also got a lot of pulp noir influences. And it's basically about this grizzled detective who has hopped through the galaxies to the city of Alphaville, which is the sort of hyper-futuristic metropolis, which is all just actually based in 1960s Paris. He seems to be on the hunt for a scientist who is called Dr. Frankenstein?
Dr. Nosferatu.
Dr. Nosferatu.
Right, yeah.
Called Dr. Nosferatu. And while he is on the tail of Dr. Nosferatu, he's seeing how this dystopian society plays out. And he is also falling in love with a level 3 seductress. So, I mean, for me, Alphaville sums up everything I love about Godard, which is it's got this very itchy trigger finger when it comes to editing, and he's got about a million ideas that he wants to chuck in a film, and you're just watching this guy who's really excitable, and he's quite young at this point as well, so he's got boundless energy. And he's also incredibly intelligent. And at the same time, he's also quite sexist a lot of the time. And it can sometimes feel like you're being spoken to by an undergrad student who has just learned about philosophy. And I'd love Godard a lot, but I do subscribe to Orson Welles' idea that he's a brilliant filmmaker and not the best thinker in the world sometimes. So I don't know if people agree or disagree. What do you, Don? Because Chris is going to say stuff. He's itching.
Yeah, like I hadn't actually seen Alphaville yet before doing this, even though it's one that I'd always meant to watch. I'm not quite sure why I put it off for so long, because it kind of seems to me like the one I would maybe like the most, with it being all dystopian and stuff. So like the other Goddard films I've seen, I tend to maybe like bits of them more than I like as a whole, because most of the time I kind of lose track of what is actually going on, and he has so much to say that I don't understand. I understand some of it, but sometimes it feels like you'd understand a bit more if you understood French in a way. But they're so very French that translating them adds another level to understand on top of that. So I guess with Alphaville, I kind of felt the same way a little bit for the first half hour or so. I didn't really know what was going on, but I stuck with it, and then gradually got more information. And I think for me, it kind of felt like the film in which his ideas and the visuals kind of seemed like one thing. They kind of were most coherent together. They work well with each other than working against each other. And there's a lot of interesting things about language and symbolism, and it kind of deconstructs the world around you as you're watching it, in kind of the way that maybe reading a book feels like, but in film form.
I like that. I think I probably like it the least out of all of us. I really do. I like it, but it probably wouldn't have made my list of this. And I can see very clearly the reasons why. And it's a bit complicated for me because I love dystopian films, but I'm not, as a general rule, that big on noir. So it's like a sort of fine balancing act. The good sides, I could watch Eddie Constantine all day. He's like the epitome of a great B-movie actor, and I really enjoy that. And he's clearly having a great time. Maybe sometimes for me, there's too many ideas all at once, and it is a standard Goddard thing. But thrown all at you, sometimes I get a little bit lost, and maybe doesn't necessarily hold my attention in the way that I would hope it would. Having said that, I still really, really like it, just maybe not as strongly as you guys do. Chris, knowing how much you love Alphaville, we'll go to you last.
So I have my issues with sort of Godard myself. Basically, I'm a big fan of later Godard. I'm a big fan of a lot of his films from maybe the 70s onwards, but especially the stuff he makes in like the 80s and the 90s I find very interesting. And a lot of the stuff in the 60s I find quite, as Kev almost said, is it does feel like someone who's heard these ideas for the very first time and has gone, look at all these ideas that I know. And like, it feels like it kind of does feel, some of them feel a bit like a student film in a sense, where it's like, oh, I heard this idea in a book that I read, I'm just going to directly translate it into the film. I have a few issues with some of the sort of early 60s films. I'm not a big fan of like A Band Apart or Breathless that much. But in saying that, Alphaville is the one film from the 60s that I really love. And I think it's because, and I don't know whether anyone else got this from it, so I need to ask you a question. I think this is quite a funny movie.
Yeah.
And I think that what it does is it takes all the tropes of science fiction, it takes all the tropes of film noir, ideas that Godard's trying to use, and it throws them all together, and none of them really stick together very well that much. And the way that it gets through it is just by being quite silly and having a lot of kind of like stupid jokes in it. Dr. Nosferatu is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, but also it's meant to be, I think, and sort of, because I know what Godard is interested later. I think it's meant to be like a joke about like how machines and are like the vampire of society in a sense. Like it's something that he talks about later. And it
so sort of moody teenage, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think it's
like
meant
the
to be
vampires.
But I think it's meant to be like both a philosophical point, but also it's an incredibly dumb joke at the same time. And same with like the scene where people who are like sort of thought traitors in a sense, that's taken an idea from something like 1984.
Yeah.
And then it's also dealing with the idea of people thinking outside of the realms of society, which is something that Godard's very interested like philosophically in. But then he puts it into a scene where a bunch of people get shot and then women in like bathing suits jump into it as though it's like a 1930s musical. And so it's just like this idea that we're going to throw every idea in, and they might not go together, but it's almost, they become absurd by how many things that don't go together go into one thing, and it becomes very amusing to me.
I think Goddard's sense of humour is, because people are a little intellectually intimidated by him a lot of the time, they don't notice that he's got loads of jokes in his films, and he kind of likes trash, and he likes just chucking trash together and seeing what fits and what doesn't in his little philosophical world.
Don, have you got any fun facts about Alpha?
Like most Goddard films, the performances and the dialogue were substantially improvised, and the assistant director had to write a 30-page treatment that was later discarded so that they could get German funding for the film, to pretend that they had a film in a story.
Oh, right, okay.
So Goddard made the assistant director write up this treatment.
Well, this is an interesting point, because I mean, you speak about Goddard now, and it's easy to forget that he was making about 3 films a year at that point in time. Like, he was incredibly prolific.
Yeah, really prolific.
And kind of, to be honest, lot of them.
I'm pretty sure this was shot in like a month or something.
Really? God, it looks beautiful as well. It's a beautiful looking film. But
I think it's all with natural light as well.
Yeah.
All of like, there's no lights at all. Like even there's like scenes when it's shot with like a lighter, because they didn't have time or money to have lighting, so they just went for it and just had every scene shot with the natural light. I think all the films that we've chosen today, with the one exception of The Apartment, are very kind of low budget films that I don't think we've really had that before. And I kind of hinted at this in the introduction, but I think there is kind of this explosion of low budget filmmaking in the 60s onwards, which are interesting because like, I think there were a lot of low budget movies in the 50s that are kind of B movies, but then there's all these people who want to make art films, and they jump into all the spots like this. The money allocated to this was probably money that would have been given to like a rubbish B movie otherwise. And then it kind of still is a rubbish B movie in many ways, but like it also has a lot of interesting things going on at the same time. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
It's kind of part of a series, isn't it? Like that character is a well-established character, so it's probably why they gave him money for it, because they thought he was going to make
a version of that. But he kind of played on it and made like the opposite of that typical version of that film.
Yeah, the guy, Eddie Constantine's character, Lemmy Caution, apparently this film, I don't know how true this is what he kind of claimed, was Lemmy Caution kind of failed after this movie because nobody wanted to see another one because they thought this made fun of him. And so he never got another job playing the character for like 20, 30 years until like the 80s. And then there were a couple more, including a very weird 90s movie made in 90 or 91, I think it might be, by Godard himself, which is not a sequel, but it is a movie with Eddie Constantine as Lemmy Caution in it that Godard made in 1990 about what Germany is like after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's a very strange slightly depressing movie, but interesting to watch.
So yeah, why do we all love Alphaville then, and think that it warrants place in the top 5? Chris?
I love it because I think there's two things I really love about it, which is one, just the kind of independent and like frivolous energy that goes into it, where it's just like, oh, this didn't work, let's just try something, let's try something here, let's try something else here. The other thing I just love about it is just that it's just so many different elements all thrown together into one movie, where it's like a sci-fi and a noir and a philosophical meditation and a comedy all at the same time. And so I like all of those things, and I think whichever one it's trying to be at that time, I'm quite happy with. So
what about you, Don?
Yeah, I think it's very visually interesting and mentally stimulating. And I guess the idea is about technology kind of taking over our lives is even more relevant nowadays, and that technology will hopefully never be able to replicate or understand emotions and the poetry and language in the way humans do. Then that will be what saves us from the robots taking over. And I guess something what Chris kind of mentioned is, I like the way the Godard takes these very American things like film noir and filters them through his mind, so you get a film that feels very familiar and also really alien at the same time.
Yeah, so I'm kind of with you on that. Like, I like the uniqueness of it. Like I say, it probably wouldn't have made mine, but I still think it's, for me, a really great film. And for, like, I can completely see why for people who enjoy those styles of films, it's almost perfect in a lot of ways. Like, there's so many fantastic aspects. I really enjoy all of the performances in them, and I think sometimes like Constantine always makes things a bit more fun for me because he's a really enjoyable actor in his performance styles. You're right, Chris, it is pretty funny at times. It's also like quite dark, and yeah, Don, like what you said about it being more relevant today than ever kind of strikes a chord as well, because certainly like with the rise of technology and stuff, you could absolutely kind of put this up and say, here's a sort of strange world that existed then with a lot of things that actually genuinely exist now. So, and I like that. Yeah. What about you, Kev?
Yeah, well, I agree with all you. I think there's this strain of the French New Wave. Jean-Pierre Melville was a particular culprit of it, and Godard does it quite a lot as well, where it's about cool guys smoking cigarettes and some pretty beautiful women who are usually Anna Karenina. And it can be a bit tiresome the older you get, really. It feels a bit infantile. And I think that where Alphaville really shines is that it kind of makes fun of that aspect of noir, particularly, and it makes fun of a lot of the genres and the more frivolous aspects of the genres, while also being a love letter to them. So it never feels mean-spirited. And Godard can be guilty of being quite cynical and really overly intellectualizing things. And Alphaville doesn't usually fall foul of that. It's so much fun. It's visually inventive in a similar vein to Daisy's actually as well. And yeah, it's a right laugh. And it's a beautiful, funny comment on modernity.
Yeah. So from a sort of beautiful, funny dystopian film, let's move to a not beautiful dystopian film, The Trial.
Segue.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, so The Trial is about Kay, who is rudely awoken and told that he's going to be under arrest for an unnamed crime. During the film, he tries to find out what crime he is being accused of and sort of tries to prove his innocence. It's a sort of dystopian nightmare of a film. Yeah, I think that's about all you need to say about it, really. Because I was just about to ruin quite a lot of it there. So, yeah. So, again, did we all rewatch this one or no? Yeah. Okay, well let's start with Dawn then. What did you think?
Yeah, I think I watched this for the first time not long after reading the book for the first time, which was a book that I really liked. But now when I thought about it, the cinematography was the only thing that really came to mind that's stayed with me over the years. Like when I think about the trial, I think of the look of it.
Yeah.
So when I was rewatching it now, I kind of find it a little difficult to get into. But I don't know if maybe I was just in the wrong mood for it, or I was maybe trying to relate it to the book that I could only vaguely remember. But I don't know. But I do love all the kind of the way in which the architecture is used in the film, and how the scale of the buildings and inside out and out makes us feel how insignificant and small Kay's character is within the whole system, and I think that's really effective.
Yeah.
In capturing that part of the book.
And what about you, Kev?
Yeah, I hadn't watched it for I think over a decade again. This in The Apartment I watched as a first year uni student, I think. And I recently read the book for the first time. So subsequently I took a lot more from the film, but I was just probably in the similar vein to Dawn. I wasn't really in the mood. I was quite tired when I watched it. I had to watch it at like 10:30 at night, and it's the book is a really draining read.
Very.
It's meant to be draining. The paragraphs go on for like 5-6 pages at a time. There's no paragraph breaks a lot of the time, and it's mainly very heavy going legalistic jargon that's designed to make your brain fry because of the ridiculousness of the situation. And Orson Welles does that. It's very long scenes, very long stretches of dialogue, and very sort of exhausting performances from people. And so I was watching it. I was pretty tired. I finished at like 1 a.m. and I was ready to fall asleep on my settee. But when I woke up the next day, I looked at the positives, and it's an incredibly faithful adaptation. It's really beautifully shot. The acting is very good, although I'm not sure how I felt about Anthony Perkins this time. It is the most faithful adaptation you could do of the trial, I think.
No, the trial's a very hard book to adapt, and I think you're right. It's about as close to an adaptation as you can get. Now, I want to move to Chris because I saw a look of utter fury on Chris's face when
I said Anthony Perkins.
Chris, Perkins.
So Perkins is great. I love Anthony Perkins, and I think there are people, and I don't know whether this is something that like you agreed with, Kev, or not, but there are people who have issues with Perkins in this film because they kind of, in the book, Kay isn't quite as angry about his situation in such a sort of like proactive way. Like Perkins is a stronger character, I think, than Kay is in the book. And people found that annoying, but I personally like that because of the fact that it's like it kind of shows the systems that he's stuck in as being extremely powerful, and so it's not like, oh, he fails because he's a weak man. Like, he is trying as hard as he can and he's still trapped within the gears of the machine. I just find the entire thing quite there's this kind of, me and Joel were talking about this beforehand, which we both had a mild problem with, is there's this kind of awkward monologue from Orson Welles at the start where he goes, "You're about to watch something that's a bit like a dream." I don't like that bit where he says that, but I do think that he's right, because it does feel like, it kind of made me think about just, it feels as though you're just sort of falling through one of those horrible nightmares that you have, where if you've done something a bit wrong, you have a nightmare where everyone is just like judging you and everyone's looking at you, and it's like this atmosphere of almost like Catholic guilt of just like, you're just a horrible person and you've done something wrong, and every situation he ends up in, everyone's always thinking the worst of him. And I find that it's not like a happy, fun watch, but I think it's a very sort of psychologically real film.
And when you're talking about Perkins' portrayal of Kay, what I think people should remember is that Kay in the book is still an asshole. Like, neither of them are pleasant people. Like, they're both quite conceited and arrogant about their plight, rather than genuinely trying to work out what happened. They both treat it with a manner of conceit, which obviously doesn't go down particularly well, but it's done differently in the film. Like you say, like Perkins plays it a little bit more aggressively, but they are both quite conceited and in a manner stuck up. And there's a scene, when you're talking about the visuals, there's a scene that really has always stuck with me from watching it, and it's the scene where he's running through the sort of tunnel with all the shadows going, and there's all these kids yelling at him. And for me, that's like almost a perfect depiction of a nightmare. It's like that you're just running through this endless tunnel, all these horrible shadows and noises around you, and like it's one of the most perfect sort of portrayals of a nightmarish scene that I think I've ever seen put to film. Having said that, again, when I rewatched it, I'm kind of with the other two. I didn't like it as much as I thought I did, but I still really, really liked it. It's just that there was, maybe a few more issues that have already really been covered that I have with it this time round.
I find it interesting because you're talking about the buildings that get used and these brutalist tower blocks. And the main sets were all actually, there was a disused railway station on the south bank of Paris, which is now the Musée d'Orsay.
Yeah.
But it's this huge, I've been in the Musée d'Orsay, it's lovely now, but when it was that railway station, you see, it's just this horrible place. And that's a very philosophically interesting place to locate it all, a disused railway station where people wait, but nothing will ever come.
Don, if I remember, you had a particularly good fact on this one.
Oh, was it about Orson Welles dubbing 11 voices in the movie, including some of Anthony Perkins' lines? And Perkins later said that he couldn't figure out which lines they were.
That's great.
There's an amazing impersonator for you. Perkins sitting back and not being able to tell which ones are his and which ones are his. It's bizarre.
I think it's quite interesting that, like, just the films that we've discussed, because I think that there's a lot of similarities in terms of, like, as we were kind of discussing with Alphaville, there's a lot of similarities in the kind of critique of modernity and of the machine making society quite logical. But even with The Apartment, there's sort of hints of that, of like people becoming drones in the kind of office work. Absolutely. And even the shots of Lemon sort of sitting in his desk is a callback to the King Vidor film, The Crowd. Yeah. And I think, I don't know whether this is true, but I think that it, like, from my personal observation, I think that the trial also calls back to that as well, with all the desks that Kay's sitting at. So I think this was definitely a kind of concern that was radiating through culture at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, if we're summarizing the trial, why do we all love the trial?
Well, only I do, apparently.
Why do we all at least really like the trial? Don?
I guess it was very masterfully constructed, and it does manage to reflect some of that nightmarish atmosphere and the complexity of the book, but it's no after hours. I much prefer to watch that. But it is good. And I guess maybe if we didn't have it, then we wouldn't have after hours.
This is true.
Yeah.
I feel like there's not been enough like film, you know, if you like this, you might like this week. So I'm glad to have something added in there. Also, I was thinking of, what's it called? The Dostoevsky adaptation that Richard Ayoade did, The Double.
Obviously, that's definitely very influenced by this.
Really heavily influenced by the trial. What about you, Kev?
Very good adaptation. It's incredibly faithful to the book, and the book is a masterpiece. It's got some very creepy scenes. I think Orson Welles himself, when he shows up, he's quite a looming, strange-looking presence as well. He's grown into a very odd-looking man by the 60s. He's got a sort of baby face that's a little creased. It's really weird. But yeah, the set design is something else. And these are all found sets. These are all found locations that are astonishing. And as I said, this sort of, I've got a particular interest in architecture in film. And the use of brutalist architecture and this disused railway station, this junkyard almost, is really evocative of Kafka in a way that I imagine more traditional directors who were less inclined to break the rules probably wouldn't lean towards a disused warehouse effectively. But Orson Welles does, and it looks amazing, and it's so bleak and just horrifying.
And what about you?
Yeah.
See, I'm gonna say something mildly controversial, which is that I saw this film before reading the file. And I prefer it. I like this film more. I find this film very interesting just in terms of like I find it a film which is filled with feelings of guilt and paranoia, which I mean are in the original text as well, but I particularly connect them with this kind of like anger that Perkins has of like unfairness, but then it's also like coming from a deeply kind of flawed place. A lot of it comes from him feeling quite privileged, and so it's almost like you see that in him and you go, oh, maybe he just thinks that because he's an asshole. Oh, and maybe if I think this, then I'm also an asshole. And then like I think also just like the like as we've all kind of discussed, the like atmosphere that he's in is also very imposing, and so it kind of is a perfect combination for me of this, like the ideas that are going through it, some very intense performances and a very intense environment in which it all takes place, and it adds up to this like blast of horrible feelings, which I mean is perhaps not the most appealing thing, but is very like effective, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to add to what everyone else has already said. I think it's a really strong kind of portrayal and evocation of a nightmare, and I think that's quite hard to capture on film. It's really well directed, really well performed, and there are some scenes that stick with you. I disagree with you. The book is much better, but I still think this is a really about as good an adaptation of that book as you're ever going to get, because I think it's a really difficult book to adapt to the screen. Yeah, so we're on to the final film of the day, and the final film is Cleo from 5 to 7. Kev, do you want to summarise this one?
Well, it's directed by Agnes Varda, who was arguably the progenitor of the French New Wave, although people dispute that. It's set almost in real time between the times of 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. It's based around the character Cleo, who is a singer. She's very traditionally beautiful. Men stare at her when she's going down the street. She looks at herself a lot. But at the beginning of the film, she has a tarot card reader which tells her she is going to, that she has contracted cancer. We then spend 2 hours in her life. It's a day in the life in which the male gaze is interrogated, the female gaze is interrogated, time is interrogated, and life and death are interrogated. And we learn a lot about Cleo, and we learn a lot about people generally.
Very good summary.
Is it happy and then sad? Or is it sad then happy?
You'll have to
watch spoilers.
Spoilers.
It does have kittens in it, though.
What do you say?
Happy. It's got kittens in it.
That's true.
Oh, yeah. Great scene.
Happy, and then the sad, and then the end.
I was petting my cat at the time, and I was going, those could be your kittens, Dolores. saying that, making fun of her. She just ignored me.
Chris, what did you think of this one?
Oh God, I'm probably not the right person to start with, because my general thoughts of it is that I can see that it's, I can see why it's good. I do enjoy it, but I don't have any strong opinions about it because it was not one of my choices. I think that there's a lot of sort of visual creativity in it. I'm personally more interested in sort of the films that are a bit more in your face about the creativity, whereas this one is a bit more classy than some of the other movies. And so I think that there's a lot of good acting going on. And I do find the most interesting parts of the film are the parts which are her relations with the other characters, but specifically the other men in the film, and how basically a large proportion of them are arseholes. And like the entire film features a lot of scenes of her having to fend off a lot of unwanted advances. And just people being really quite unpleasant towards her, like a guy who sort of tries to grab her out of his car window at one point, which is quite unpleasant. And I think there's also the other side, which is like it's not like all these horrible things are happening to this like pure, brilliant person. She is quite a sort of vain and conceited person as well. And I think that the film is quite interesting in its treatment of sort of breaking down the assumptions that she has about herself. And I mean, we're not going to spoil what happens in it, but I think that she does kind of come to some realizations about her character, which at the start she is, I think, a lot less likable character that she becomes.
And what about you, Dawn?
Yeah, I remember liking it on a first watch, but I maybe only noticed the more vanity-driven side of her personality, and I maybe didn't see all the other things going on beneath that, or I don't remember them as much. But I definitely got a lot more out of it rewatching it, I think. And I see it as kind of not just a portrait of Cleo, but of all different kinds of modern women and the problems that they face on a daily basis, like being leered at and harassed and not taken seriously as well. Like we get to see a female taxi driver and her friend who's an artist model, and the girl in the cafe with her boyfriend. It's all different kinds of women that we normally don't get to see in films.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And like Chris, when you were saying like stuff about like her vanity and stuff, I think a lot of that's like to do with defenses that she's built up as well, which I don't think you necessarily notice, or certainly I didn't notice the first time I saw this. Like there's a lot of defenses and anxieties that she's built up over time. That's not to say she hasn't become arrogant or conceited.
I really love the bit where she sings a song and she kind of starts crying, like in the way that singing is usually seen as a performance of emotion, but in her case it's her whole life is kind of a performance for other people, and that reveals her true feelings at that moment.
Well, I think that's really the turning point of the film for me, really, because I mean she seems like a slightly trivial figure for the first, maybe that's the first 15 minutes of the film, and prior to that she has a tarot card reading which seems a bit hokey. She kind of makes a scene in a cafe fairly unnecessarily, then goes and buys a hat, and then does some very trivial exercises that don't actually do much physically, and it's all a show and it's all about performance. And then she realizes that she basically realizes that she has talent and that she has more than the performance, despite the fact that the song is written by a man and the performance that she's given is in fact all being dictated by the men around her who don't respect her in some way. And she kind of seems to find some sort of value in herself when she sings, and realizes that this guy who's been putting her down It reminded me a lot, because I mean, we're speaking about modern women, and there was the Ryan Adams thing in the Me Too debacle, Me Too controversies, where he was basically any woman who would come in order to get one over on them so that you could have creative control. He would say, "Oh, you just sing. You're not worth anything, no matter how talented they were." And that's basically happening to her at the start. So this is a very up-to-date film in terms of what it seems to be discussed. Obviously, I'm not a woman myself, so a lot of these things tend to be almost surprises to me. But it's about very modern female issues to me. And it also, by the way, this is three guys chatting about this and one woman. As a guy watching it, you do kind of realise how implicated you are as a viewer.
Kick up the backside of a film, isn't it?
Yeah, but she is strikingly beautiful, and you sort of want. You wouldn't go and obviously I wouldn't go and catcall someone, but you would probably crane your neck a bit without thinking about it. You know, so it implicates you and it makes you sort of a guilty party in the film as well as a guy, which I think is a useful thing because there's so few female directors who can actually comment on male behaviour because they're not allowed in to the club, you know. So I think it's a really useful watch from that perspective.
As well, talking about looking when she meets the soldier and they're on the bus going to the hospital and he's looking at her, but it doesn't feel really that he's looking at her, he is looking in her. You get the impression that he's not just kind of staring at her beauty, but he's seeing something more, and maybe he's the only one that's really doing that in the film.
Yeah, I see that. It's funny
he's a different kind of guy, yeah.
After
first, you think he's doing the same thing when he approaches her, and she's kind of cautious.
It's funny, after watching that scene, Kev and Chris both messaged me saying, do we think that Richard Linklater had been watching that particular scene for Before Sunrise, where there's almost an identical scene. And I think watching it, it's so clearly influenced a lot of kind of probably more sort of 90s films, would you say? Like a lot of those kind of like real-time kind of walkie-talkie, not walkie-talkie, but like walk and talk 1990s, kind of early 90s films.
Yeah, I think my kind of issues with it come from that not really being a style of film that I'm very interested in. But I mean, the fact that this is a progenitor of an entire style of film is kind of like, while it might not be my perfect thing, I actually prefer this a lot more to quite a lot of the later films which end up with people sort of wandering around and having conversations as their day progresses, because I think that this actually is quite an interesting perspective where I think a lot of them can get focused on men quite a lot and like pseudo-philosophical conversations that men are having, which is not nearly as interesting as what's happening in this film. So I think it's better than a lot of the films that I think are influenced by it.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, it's not a style of filmmaking that I particularly have an interest in, but I think that it's an incredibly influential movie and an incredibly sort of interesting movie thematically.
I feel like that's you kind of summarized why you really like Theo. So I want to ask you, but let's go to Dawn then. Why do you really love it?
Yeah, I think it still feels so fresh and relevant and inventive today. And the ideas about beauty and mortality and time are all explored without ever feeling heavy in a way. It can be like, it feels like it should be really dense, but it's so light and playful that it doesn't. And I think it kind of gets better with every watch. But you kind of get a little bit more out of it each time.
I forgot to ask you if you found any fun facts for Cleo.
What was it? The German title is Wednesday from 5 to 7, even though it takes place on a Tuesday.
Which is just incorrect. So
so many facts I found, surprisingly. Like there'd be loads of facts on it.
Do you think it's one that people miss sometimes then?
I think people are maybe more aware of Agnes Varda now than they were, 5 years ago. It feels like there's kind of been a big boom in interest in her.
Definitely has been a resurgence, hasn't there?
Yeah. Because she kept, making all these documentaries, which were quite popular, I think. And then people maybe explored her older work after seeing those.
Yeah.
Kind of what I did, maybe.
What about you then, Kev?
I think it's a fantastic film. I think I was saying to you, because I mean, this comparison to something like Before Sunrise or that ilk, or the films that started out. I think that Cleo for 57 is so different because it's anything but meandering. Like every frame has a point. Every scene is about something, and it's all building towards something much bigger than itself. And it's building towards this idea, this discussion about one woman that becomes a very, very universal idea about how people look and about life and death and all that stuff that we've discussed. And I think it does manage to compact a hell of a lot into 90 minutes. And it's brilliantly acted. It's feels like Varda's thesis at that point. It's so beautifully communicated what she wants to say. And I love Varda anyway, from Point de Court onwards. Brilliant director.
I would again agree with pretty much everything that's said. It's interesting here, Chris, because like the contrast between you and I, this film is almost exactly up my street, whereas Alpha almost exactly up your street. So we've got two here that
are I just want to jump in very quickly to I absolutely my entire issues with this movie are all aesthetic. Like I think that everything else, especially thematically, I think this is a flawless movie. It's just aesthetically, it's not.
It's not a court, Chris. That's fine.
Well, no, I just wanted to sort of make that clear,
It's all right.
I think
I'm on your side.
as you say, as this kind of essay, I think that it gets its point across really well, and I love the point that it's making. It's more just aesthetically, it's not to my taste. But Joel, it is to his taste.
It's my taste. I do like these sort of real-time style films. And yeah, Kev, you're completely right that like there isn't anything in there that is. It's that idea that what seems meandering always comes round, and there's always a point, and there's always, quite often what's discussed earlier comes back again later, and I absolutely love that about it. And I think, sort of points that are made that may seem trivial always have a point, and they always have a purpose later on in the film, and I love that about it. I think that makes it almost perfect at what it's trying to do, really. So yeah, I think you guys summarized it better than I probably could, but it's fantastic. So yeah, I think this week we've had a really interesting discussion on a lot of quite different films there actually, but also some with some really strong similarities as well. So overall then, what's everyone's favourite film of the 1960s? The bit we all love. Who will we start with? Chris?
Well, before I say what my favourite film is, I would like to just say this is probably my favourite shortlist that we've had so far. I think with some of the other decades, there's been maybe one film on there where I've not been quite so keen. And while I might have been a little bit down on Cleo, like compared to you guys, I still really loved it. And I would say that this is extremely strong films. And if anyone's got to this part of the podcast, I would say
they might be switching off now, Chris. Jesus,
yeah, I think you should watch all of them. I think they're all brilliant. I actually was originally, like, in my list when we put this, I had Alphaville at the top, but I've changed my mind after rewatching them. I've changed which film I'm going to have as my favorite, and I'm going to say Daisies is my favorite film of the 1960s. I just think it is so in your face and so experimental in terms of just throwing everything it possibly can at you. I think that it's challenging every assumption you could possibly have. And I think that it's just filled with this energy and love of filmmaking and like complete disregard for what anyone cares about it, what anyone thinks about the ideas it's challenging. It's just like, let's just do what we want to do and just be as like outrageous as we want to be. And I just love it. I thought it was absolutely amazing.
Dawn?
I think for me, it's probably between The Apartment and Cleo. And I do really love all the ideas and some of the things in Cleo, but maybe at the moment The Apartment is the best overall experience. But I think maybe if I rewatched Cleo again, it might overtake it. But today I will say The Apartment.
Kev?
It was a coin toss for me as well between The Apartment and Cleo, so we're on the same page there. And I don't know. I still don't know.
Do you want to go to me first?
You go.
Okay, for me it was a coin toss between The Apartment. Yeah, I mean, I also still don't know, so I don't know why I volunteered myself.
I don't think I've got a coin on us, unfortunately.
Well, I'll tell you what then, to give Kev the casting vote, because I'm very 50-50 on this. I'll say Cleo. Even though I thought for me, either of those could be the best film of the 60s. I thought they were both almost perfect in what they were trying to do, and I love both of them.
I feel like even though I've said The Apartment, I want Cleo to win. So you have to pick it.
Well, I'm going to say The Trial now. Not really. I think that The Apartment is impeccably written and gorgeous, and the characterization's brilliant, and it's aged amazingly well for considering the content. It's aged amazingly. I'd probably go with Cleo, to be honest. I think that while The Apartment is emotionally bottomless and will always surprise you, Cleo is intellectually bottomless, and you'll always find something new in it. And right now, that's what I'm after.